I served with the United States Marine Corps in 1968 and 1969 in Vietnam.
You may know him as a former Maricopa County attorney, but Rick Romley says his life was first shaped by his time in Vietnam.
We were doing a sweeping operation right outside of Marble Mountain.
That's when Romley stepped on a booby trap.
They call it IEDs now. Booby trap is probably more descriptive.
Romley was severely injured. He severed 2 arteries, suffered multiple skin lacerations and broken bones.
I was pretty much awake the whole time. I remember going through the air and I hit the ground, and that's when the pain started, and it was really bad.
He spent his last year in the Marines hospitalized.
I was very, very close to giving up. And then I remember that they brought in another Marine and crying, couldn't take the pain. He just wanted to die. And here I am thinking the very same thing. But when you see a fellow soldier, you know, going through that, for some crazy reason, I talked to him and I said, it gets easier. Don't give up. It gets easier. And here I was ready to give up. And for some reason, that was a real pivotal time in my life that gave me some strength that I never knew I had. And I guess it's because of your love for your fellow soldier. Don't know what happened to him.
The pain now comes from remembering those who never made it back from Vietnam, including Romley's best friend.
Every Memorial Day, now I'm usually the MC at the National Cemetery, but I still make time either the day before or later that evening. I go out to the Arizona Vietnam Memorial, my dear friend. I take flowers and put it out there.
It's a story Romley doesn't often speak of.
I don't talk often about myself. I just don't.
But he did to a student from Veterans Heritage Project.
I just think it's such an extraordinary project.
Provide students the opportunity to learn history firsthand from someone who lived it.
That's what the Veterans Heritage Project does.
Every veteran in there gets a copy, and we put like a nameplate in there, specialized.
Students from across the state interview veterans. What they learn goes into a book, which ends up in the Library of Congress.
They have over 100,000 narratives that they've put in the library, and we're the single biggest contributor to that, which to me is a real source of pride for history.
Former high school teacher Barbara Hatch began the program. She says it all started with a movie.
A kid came in and said, "Is that movie real?"
The movie was Saving Private Ryan.
The beach scene, from everything I've read, seems pretty accurate, but Phoenix, big place. Let's see if we can find some Normandy vets.
From those first student visits years ago, Hatch began a program to bring vets in to speak to her students. Photos of those first visits still hang on the classroom wall.
They really wanted to share it with somebody.
In 2005, students at Cactus Shadows High School in Cave Creek published their first book, filled with experiences veterans had never shared before.
These kids in this program, they get it.
I went through basic training at Fort Sam Houston.
In 1965, Pat Little Upai signed up for a student nurse program. The Army paid for the last years of her nurse's training, and after graduation, she volunteered for Vietnam.
I was assigned to go to the 93rd Evac Hospital.
It was a quiet posting at first.
And then one evening, Tet started.
The 1968 New Year's Tet Offensive caught much of the U.S. Armed Forces in Vietnam by surprise.
Not only was there a lot of weapons firing, a lot of noise and chaos, they had hit an ammunition dump.
Then the casualties started to mount.
We started, working 16 hours for, about a week or so, and then we went on 12-hour shifts. It was just a very intense time and an eye-opener for a young nurse who was like, whoa. Did I sign up for this?
Years later, Colonel Little Upas served in Desert Storm, the 1991 Gulf War.
Desert Storm was a very short war. It was a very, very intense war. It was a very scary war.
Earlier this month, Pat Little Upa visited Cactus Shadows to speak to the students working on this year's edition of the project's 13th. Her story was published in the 2009 edition.
Our challenge was that we were taking care of young men who we could be dating back home.
Rick Romley was there too. His story was also published in '09.
When individuals are wounded, you never forget that day.
And students talked about the veteran interviews that they conducted this year.
I didn't get to hear his story before. He didn't talk about it very much.
My first year, I was in this club. I met John Eloff. He was a World War II Marine. He was on Saipan.
The second veteran I interviewed was Captain Richard Narica. He was a submarine captain.
While one was one of the first students to interview a Gold Star wife.
She was avoiding the subject of losing her husband for quite a while. She only talked about it for about 20 minutes, and there was a lot of tears shed after those 20 minutes.
I spent 30 years in the Army.
Also meeting the students this day, retired Army Colonel Jim Kelsey.
To this day, it's still one of the greatest things that's occurred to me and my family, and I thank you all.
As Marines push through the jungle, they must overcome natural obstacles as well as the enemy hiding someplace in the dense growth.
In 1965, Kelsey was a second lieutenant stationed in Hawaii.
White uniforms, the beach.
But his time in paradise was short-lived.
New Year's Eve, 1965, I took 44 men in on a C-123 into Pleiku, Vietnam. 44 went in, 8 came home.
After a year training in Special Forces, Kelsey went back for a second tour, this time in charge of a rifle company.
The hardest part of being any kind of a leader, but a leader in combat, is that I didn't bring everybody home.
Kelsey was wounded 4 times and decided 2 deployments to Vietnam was enough.
I'm going back a third time. I'm not going to make it.
Instead, Kelsey spent the next 26 years in Army intelligence.
In my case, I got to also fight the Cold War. I was in Germany 3 times. And I was there when the wall came down. This is an original piece of the Berlin Wall.
Kelsey retired as a U.S. Army colonel and later told his story to the Veterans Heritage Project.
You don't remember the good orders you gave. You remember the bad orders you gave. And you remember the consequences. And I live with those every day.
And when Kelsey talks to students about Vietnam, he holds nothing back.
No one can understand the pleasure of sitting on a real toilet and flushing it until you've gone a year without ever doing that.
Kelsey's story was published in the 2010 edition.
If you look at the books, all of these books, and they've got 80-some stories this time, I am sure it could be 8,000 if they had enough students to do it.
These young people with this experience, they get a whole different sense of what it is like to serve and the sacrifices.
To them, maybe it saw a little bit of living history, and I think that's important. They need to understand that, and it's a little bit different than just reading it. But when you talk to us, you know, you're trying to tell your story, your tears well up in your eyes. They see that. So.